So thank you so much, Dr. Hanan Ashrawi, for being with us today. We are very excited
My pleasure. Yeah.
to have this conversation with you.
I cannot resist joining students. I mean, I can say no to big names, but when students ask me, I have a weakness for students.
This is to our pleasure, really.
Thank you.
So I also would like to thank everyone who's joining us today. The timing is a little bit tricky for students because it's still lecture time, but this is going to be recorded and posted and shared in our social media, so they will get to have access. And I also would like to give a special thank you to Mosaic Central or Al-Quds Library in Berlin, because they are hosting a live screening of this call now. They will send us their questions in the chat. Also, would like to we appreciate support from Respond the Crisis NGO in hosting this event via Zoom. This is another partner of us who works with refugees. They offer translation services to refugees and vulnerable groups, and we encourage people to Google them and also support their work. But also, you could use their help. They almost never say no to any translation requests, and they have been doing great work for people in Gaza. As per our usual, we will start our session today with a quick introduction about our group, and then about Dr. Hanan. And after that, we will have a dialogue with you, Doctor, and then we will receive questions from people who are joining us online and in Mosaic Center.
Wonderful.
So this lecture is organized by Student Coalition Berlin's lecture series. We are a group of students from all different disciplines who are both deeply concerned about the unfolding events in Palestine, Israel, and the ongoing discourse and knowledge production about this topic in Germany, or the lack of it for that matter. With us today, Dr. Hanan Ashrawi, who is a distinguished Palestinian leader, legislator, activist, and scholar, making history as the first woman to hold a seat in the highest executive body in Palestine. She was elected as a member of the Executive Committee of Palestine Liberation Organization, famous as PLO, in 2009 and 2018, from which she resigned in 2020. She founded the Independent Commission for Human Rights, as well as MIFTAH and AMAN. Her life story and contributions are so rich that it's really hard to comprehend them. But I really hope today's talk will give us a chance to allow us to, get more glimpse of it and learn a lot from you. And now, without further ado, I want to start our conversation with a question about you. So first of all, welcome again.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
It's our pleasure, really. So we always like to start our conversations talking a little bit about the journey of our speaker, and you have played many different roles along your career. Would you tell us a little bit more about the major milestones of your journey, and how much of it was no, the ones you think are significant, especially for people like us, diversity of audience, but also people who are kind of struggling, moving around our academic life, but also activism for Palestine. Especially tell us how much of it was planned as opposed to you felt you have to take it up. And again, it's something we're studying, and we feel studying alone is not enough. And as I mentioned, this is why we have this lecture series, because we felt our universities are not offering what we're looking for.
Yeah, certainly official or structured education is not the only education you get. And lifelong learning is sometimes outside the ivory tower. But anyway, to all of us, to Palestinians, and to many people, I think sometimes you don't have the luxury of choice. If you're born a Palestinian, I've always said you are born with a burden and a responsibility and a challenge. The mere fact of your being, your existence, your name is a challenge to others, sometimes evokes extreme responses and so on, because Palestine is not a neutral term. And the fact of your existence and your identity can be seen as a threat to other agendas, primarily Western colonial agendas, primarily the fundamental Zionist agenda, and so on, because they would much rather have us all disappear. So from the beginning, they started this trajectory of erasure of trying to, as Ilan Pape always says, the displacement replacement paradigm, to displace all the Palestinians, remove them, their history, their culture, their existence, their identity, and everything, and replace them with another people, which is what happened in 1948. And I was a baby then, so that must have been a very important part of my life when my parents were in Tiberias, and then we had to, I mean, my father was a doctor, so he was moving from one city to the other, and in 48 he was in Tiberias. And when the war broke out, he left, he took the family and went to Amman, and then came back to Ramallah, which is where he is from originally. So that was the main thing. Now, all our lives, stations of my life, I was sheltered in many ways. They didn't want us to experience the horror of the Nakba, because the Nakba was based on a series of massacres, a series of full destruction and razing of whole villages, 500 some villages totally destroyed, the expulsion of half the Palestinian population from Palestine. So it was a traumatic experience to everybody. And I think my parents' generation, who experienced the Nakba firsthand, tried to shelter us, tried to shelter their children, and to chart a new course so we don't experience the Nakba. Little did they know that the Nakba is an ongoing process and has been repeating itself at different stages, and now it has come to a head. It's culminating in genocide, because the two trajectories of Palestinians without any kind of protection or rights, as opposed to Israel with preferential treatment, exceptionalism, and full impunity, that these two trajectories would lead to genocide. When you have one state that thinks it can have full control and full rights to do whatever it wants to a captive population, kill, destroy, massacre, steal the land, resources, demolish homes, expel people, and so on, that ultimately this is what will happen. And there are many writers who predicted that this is where this line of development was leading to, or this descent, I guess, when international law, international humanitarian law apply only to the powerful, and the weak and the vulnerable are totally left at the mercy of the powerful. So this is, in a sense, the context of my life. I went to Beirut, American University of Beirut. I studied in Ramallah, French school. I went to Beirut and did my bachelor's and master's there in English literature and in textual criticism and in Renaissance studies. Very esoteric, but personally, I like scholarship. And then in '67, I couldn't go home. So I had to find a place to go because Israel occupied the West Bank. I couldn't get a permit to go home. I didn't have a visa to stay in Beirut. So I went to the States because I got admitted to a university in the States, University of Virginia, where I got my PhD, and then the long journey to come home. But anyway, all my life in Beirut and in the States and so on, I was an activist. I was part of the student revolt, the student revolution, which is now repeating itself again in the States. It's incredible that you are seeing a student revolution in real time again. And it echoes, it reverberates my experience in the late 60s and 70s of how the students managed to change policies, to challenge power, to bring about serious transformations in the world, whether it's the Vietnam War or others, in the States, in Europe, everywhere. So anyway, as I said, I was part of the student movement, and wherever I went, I established committees, groups, and so on, American Friends of Free Palestine, or the Arab Students Association, or Palestinian. I was part of the Union of Palestine Students. And in Beirut, I was elected to the General Union as a representative. And this is where I met the Palestinian leadership, because they were in exile outside. And we were not allowed and not able to meet them. So when I met them, it was something amazing to me. And anyway, from then I moved on from Beirut to the States, and I came back. I came back with a family reunion. I established the legal aid committee for Palestinian prisoners, and especially university, Madrid University, where I was teaching. I later became dean, and now I'm the head of the chair of the board of trustees of Madrid University. So my life has been, associated with academics all my life. But academics and activism go hand in hand, because as I don't believe in the ivory tower approach. I believe academics teach critical thinking and awareness regardless of your subject field, and therefore you teach responsibility and networking and communication and standing up for matters of conscience or what you believe in. My father always said you have to be courageous in the pursuit of right. So, and I was surrounded, by a family that was supportive. My father was a real feminist, by the way. So it's very important to note that in the early 20s, my father was writing about how women have the right to be free, to be equal, as a right, not as a gift from the men, not as a condescending gift from the men. So from the beginning, he said, I will not put any constraints or restrictions on you. Don't accept any external restrictions on you. So he taught us all, we were 5 sisters, to be courageous in the pursuit of truth and to respect ourselves as human beings and not to be intimidated and not to accept other people's constraints. And, then in my political work, I did many things. Yes, I was elected to the Legislative Council. I became Minister of Higher Education and Research, and then later on PLO Executive Committee member. It's the official political positions were all, in a sense, not so much by choice, because I didn't want to be in the PLO executive. I'm much more of an activist, and I wanted to be part of civil society. I set up 3 civil society organizations, MIFTAH and AMAN, and the Independent Commission for Human Rights. So I was quite happy there, but quite often you are, called upon, like in the meeting of the National Council to elect the Executive Committee for the PLO, all the traditional organizations, parties, movements, and the main leaders came together and agreed on a group, on a list of names to be chosen by default to the PLO executive. So the General Union of Palestine Women, the women of different factions refused. They said, we want to have women in the executive committee and we want to have elections. We will not accept a political deal. So they rebelled. And this rebellion, I couldn't say no to. They said, we want to enter elections with you as our weapon, so to speak. So they nominated me and we had elections and I won because the women mutinied against their own parties. The young people also mutinied and I ended up winning, in spite of the fact that other, the president and others had nominated men to run against me, but they lost. So in some ways, I had decided not to be part of the official system. And yet, if I was going to be part of the women's struggle and defiance and mutiny, I couldn't say no. So there are too many stations in my life to go through. You can read my book when you want to, but still, it's important to understand transformations and turning points and to know where you need to intervene in history and when there is a demand for you, where you can, in a sense, respond to this demand.
Yeah, I think what you said is very good, because I was gonna ask you to give us a crash course. I will explain in what. So before we get into more depth into the politics of Palestine and the resistance, I think, at least I think for me and lots of people, there is lots of confusion about the political representation of Palestinians. Like, so what is the PLO? What is the PA? And is Hamas in the PLO? So can you give us like a crash course or 101 of Palestinian political representation and like the kind of how they connect together?
Yeah, well, the PLO was established, as you know, in the early 60s as a response to the displacement and expulsion of Palestinians and so on, to attempt to find a voice and a representative body for the Palestinian people. And it was the PLO. It started with the Arab League and it was formed with the at the initiative of the Arab countries, but in many ways it was taken over by the Palestinians completely. So it had the slogan of the PLO is national unity, regional or Arab solidarity, and liberation. And later on, of course, the national agenda included the right of return and self-determination. So this is the overall political message and stance of the PLO. And it developed through the years as a representative body for Palestinians everywhere, whether in exile, in the refugee camps, expats, or under occupation, or in 48 Palestine, where the indigenous people stayed after the creation of the State of Israel. So it was a comprehensive representative body. And since we couldn't have elections everywhere, you had the unions, General Union of Palestine Students, General Union of Palestine Women. These are sectoral unions, the unions of workers, of teachers, of professionals, and so on. So this was one way in which you can have broad representation, even where you cannot hold elections. The unions would hold elections. And the same thing with the political factions, because at that time, of course, it was a time of revolution. So we had many political factions and revolution leaders, but each faction would elect or choose its own representatives to the PLO. So that's why it was socially, economically, politically, and so on representative in a comprehensive way. And we saw in this, we saw in the PLO, as Yasser Arafat used to say, it is the national home of the Palestinians, of all Palestinians. And therefore it embodies our right to self-determination and our identity as a people, regardless of where we are, because many were refugees and different types of oppression, as you know. So that's why to us, it was extremely important. It was illegal under occupation to belong to any faction of the PLO, to belong to the PLO itself. And even when we started negotiations and I was in the leadership committee of the Madrid Process and the spokesperson, we were not allowed to associate with the PLO or to say with. So every time we had a meeting with the Secretary of State, then James Baker, or President George Bush, we would say, we are here at the behest of the PLO. We are the people of the PLO. So it was a challenge. Even during the Intifada, we used to carry the Palestinian flag, and before that, and it was illegal to carry the flag or be part of the PLO. So to us, it was an achievement. It was something that we established in defiance and as a challenge. And there was a period, a long period of armed struggle that gave the PLO lots of credibility and international connections and so on. Gradually, the PLO adopted the sort of peaceful approach, the negotiations approach, the peaceful settlement approach, rather than the armed struggle. It evolved in many different ways. And with the signing of the Declaration of Principles, or what is called the Oslo Process, the PLO established what is called the PNA, the Palestine National Authority, which people call the PA, the Palestine Authority. And it was initially established in order to be an organization, the arm of the PLO in the transitional phase to deliver services and build institutions. And the PLO remains the political address of all Palestinians everywhere. I know what's happening. Unfortunately, the Americans and others definitely wanted to get rid of the PLO from the beginning. They didn't want us to have anything to do with the PLO, but we managed to get it and place it on the world agenda and the stage as a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Unfortunately, gradually with the establishment of the PA, and we had elections, as the PA would have a legislative body, and I ran for elections there, and it would have a judicial system. In a sense, many people saw in this the seminal stages of government, of the authorities of government. But gradually, and I think also with some cooperation from some of our own political leadership, the PLO became weaker and weaker, and the PA became stronger and stronger. So it subsumed, it took the powers of the PLO, which kept only its name, which became more titular than a real political address. And lots of people were very unhappy with this. The Palestinians did not want this. We didn't want to be cornered into a PA, which is supposed to be a functional body and institution. We wanted to maintain the PLO as the national address and representative body. So here we are now with gradually with presidential decrees, the Legislative Council was disbanded, the judicial body was in many ways subject to the executive powers of the president. And so with the PLO executive weakened, which is why I left, I tried desperately to strengthen it, didn't work. And with the legislative body gone, with the judiciary under the control of the presidency, we ended up with a much more of a centralized system and with the weakening of the PLO. That's why the protest movement within Palestine now, the reform movement, which is not subject to any external agenda, whether it's American, European, or otherwise, is based on empowering the PLO to make it truly representative, to include all the factions that were excluded, including Hamas and Islamic Jihad and so on, and to move ahead with a liberation agenda, to unite. When you talk about national unity, you have to unite all the people, rather than to be restricted and limited to the functional approach, administrators under the control of the Israeli occupation.
Well, thank you so much. And صحة. I wanted to say صحة, but
what happened now? I'm hold on, much better. Yeah.
I want to tell people that you can already put your questions in the chat. We'll check them once we have enough questions. We'll go. Having started the talk about the Palestinian political body, and it's really useful. Thank you so much for explaining.
It can be very confusing.
It can, and I'm Syrian, so we have already confusing one too. So I want to go to a couple of quotations that you have mentioned a few times. One is related to the negotiations. You always said we Palestinians have done all type of negotiations, and you count them. But you also said we've been held responsible for the safety of our occupiers. For me, somehow I feel there is a little bit of confusion. Like, while speaking about all these types of negotiations, knowing that you kind of, as you mentioned, held responsible or put in an unjust position, how can you explain that? Why would the Palestinians go to negotiation where it sounds doomed, where it sounds unjust?
Yeah.
And what did that mean in general? Like, going, what did it mean for you in practical terms? And not going, what would that mean in also in practical terms?
Yeah, well, the real negotiations, the Madrid process, started in 1991. And it was after the Gulf War, and it was as a result of Arab-American agreements, interventions, that the Americans would solve the Palestinian question, would initiate negotiations in order to find a solution to the Palestinian questions as a result of having an Arab coalition with the Americans during the Gulf War. It was very clear it was the Arabs that wanted negotiations, and the PLO was in many ways on board because it wanted legitimacy, it wanted recognition as a representative, and we were designated by the PLO to negotiate. Now, this was 91, and we entered negotiations as a political battle. We didn't enter negotiations to surrender. We said this very clearly. We are there in order to get our freedom, our liberty. If you want to read a statement that's very important, which I wrote, but others, of course, had their hand in it, read the Madrid speech that Haidar Abdeshafi read at the convening of the conference. It's called the Madrid speech because it's the Palestinian position on why we are here. And we tried to present the Palestinian narrative and rights and our search and struggle for freedom, for dignity, for self-determination. So that was our reason to enter negotiations, of course, and to bring out the PLO to gain its recognition and legitimacy. As we were negotiating in Madrid and then in Washington, there were secret talks behind the scenes in Oslo. And they are the ones who drafted what is called the Declaration of Principles and started the Oslo Process, a totally different track. So it would take ages for me to explain, but we adopted the territorial approach, the legal approach, the political human approach, the comprehensive approach. They adopted the functional approach, separation of people and the land, the phased approach. So we were two totally different approaches to negotiations. We saw ourselves as fighters. None of us was a politician or had any official position. We were all either academics, friends, and so on, who went to defend the Palestinian cause and to present it to the world. And we knew it was a challenge because we were negotiating with our occupiers. I told James Baker, what you're doing is illegal. You are bringing a people under occupation to negotiate with their occupiers. And this violates the Fourth Geneva Convention and international humanitarian law. So he hit the ceiling. But anyway, so this is where we were. Now, pursuing that, there were many flaws with the negotiating process. As you know, they drafted an agreement which was severely flawed, the Oslo Agreement, the Declaration of Principles, which left all the power in the hands of Israel through the transitional phase. And Israel, of course, maintained its control and its power and its settlement expansion and its annexation of Jerusalem and so on, even though they had signed this agreement. And this agreement had a long annex dealing with security, coordination, had 1 or 2 paragraphs on human rights. And of course, that drove me crazy because I was very much concerned with human rights. I saw in this really the road to disaster in many ways. I said we have to try to make the most of it, but they have signed it. And I asked if we could renegotiate. They said you couldn't. So there we were caught in this historical trap. And it ended up with the Americans who had sided with the Israelis all along. They were supposedly the sponsors of the talks. And I said, by no stretch of the imagination can you accuse the Americans of being even-handed mediators at all, because they brought a strategic alliance with Israel to bear on the negotiations. They acted as Israel's lawyers and advocates. They coordinated their positions with Israel and so on. So again, there was this wisdom, the American approach, that so long as the two sides were talking, then God in his heaven, all's well with the world. It was all's well with the world. So negotiations became an end unto itself. Keep the Palestinians negotiating, give Israel room and time to continue to expand and steal land and resources and even kill people and build settlements, do whatever it wants, continue with its criminal agenda, so to speak. But the Palestinians can deal with their own daily lives. My statement then was that while under direct occupation, we were summoned by the military governor, the Israeli military governor, and he offered us to run our lives. He gave us 35 functions, and we refused. I remember I told him, we are not collaborators. We will not work for you as an occupation. We know how to run our schools and our hospitals and so on. He said, take the task of the civil administration. I said, of course we can do that, but we don't want to do it while you are our occupiers. We will not cooperate with you. So he said, you leave, you end the occupation, and of course we will run our lives. And so we were arrested, but that's another story. So now in this agreement, what they did was accept to sort of run our lives in the functional tasks, the daily lives, while the sovereign issues, the real issues, like we were asking for the population register, the land register, and so on, because these are attributes of sovereignty. This is what we wanted. We didn't want to have tasks and functions and institutions under the occupation. We wanted to end the occupation, and that didn't work. So that's why I said very facetiously that the Palestinians and we have negotiated, because we were constantly under pressure. You have to negotiate more, negotiate more, negotiate more. I said, the Palestinians, we have negotiated every possible way, direct, indirect, bilateral, multilateral, I don't know what, epistolary, changing. We had about maybe 10 forms of negotiation. But if the powerful side has all the power and control, and if the peace broker supposedly is one-sided, and if there is no arbitration, and if there's no verification, monitoring and verification, and if there are no terms of reference, and if there are no clear objectives, and if they don't follow international law, you could negotiate forever, which is what Samir wanted. He said, I want them to negotiate forever. In the meantime, we will fill the West Bank with settlements. So there will be no need for negotiation. They become irrelevant. And this is exactly what they did. Unfortunately, our leadership was duped in the sense that they felt if they continue negotiations, that's fine, that gives them credibility and recognition and standing, and that ultimately they will lead to something. And unfortunately, our worst fears, were realized, and we knew that this type of negotiations within such a blatant asymmetry of power, with such a blatant American bias, was such an Arab helplessness, so to speak, that we were left at the mercy of our occupiers. And this is where we are now. The second part of your question, I said something about, yes, now part of the agreement that they signed, the Declaration of Principles, which was severely flawed, as I said, part of the agreement was that the Palestinians were held responsible really for the safety of the occupation army and the settlers. In the sense that you have no jurisdiction or power. Your police force, your security apparatus has no right to stand up to any Israeli army or Israeli settler. But the Israeli army can follow Palestinians everywhere and can arrest or in hot pursuit, as they said, and so on. So when the Israeli army would come to Palestinian territory, the poor security forces would have to disappear. They cannot even stand up to them to prevent them from harming the Palestinians. This is why now you have all sorts of groups and organizations who say we need to protect ourselves. You're not protecting us. And this is one of the really very ironic and painful outcomes of such negotiations, when you allow yourself to be held responsible for the safety of the settlers and the army that are killing your own people. And I kept repeating that our security forces have to protect the Palestinian people. So, and I have many instances and cases, but anyway, I said that because that's the truth. And the world would hold us accountable. The Americans would say if a settler was injured or killed, you cannot do that. This is, you know, Israelis would say it's terrorism. Or if an Israeli soldier was injured or killed, they would accuse everybody of being terrorists, and then you end up with collective punishment and house demolitions and so on. So yeah, in many ways, they illegalized our struggle for liberation or resistance. And at the same time, they enabled the occupation to continue with the worst form of oppression and violence that they had used all along.
Whoa, thank you. Thank you so much. Number one, first, I'm happy we already have lots of questions. Adam is sending questions from the people in Mosaic. So we'll get to it after. This is kind of this question I really need to ask, because we all see what the Israeli army is doing in Gaza. We see this clear kind of visible side of things, but there is a side that is also very important for people in the US and Europe to understand, and especially in Germany, since we are here, which is in relation to the Israeli lobbying. So I don't think there is a person that can, who is not engaged in the politics, even engaged, could how strong the Israeli lobbying is, especially in the West. Yeah. So my question is, could you explain a little bit to us about the mechanism of the Israeli lobbying? How does it impact Western policy? And what does that mean for Palestinians? And if you could, while telling us that, we understand how strong it is in the US, but also in Europe, and again, looking at Germany, if you have input on this.
Wow, that's a very long question. I don't know if
sorry.
I can answer everything. But look, I'm ending up giving you very long answers, and I don't want to bore your audience or your listeners, but let me say very candidly, the pro-Israel lobby has been in existence for a long time. It's not something new. And it has developed and evolved, and it has gained traction in the West for a variety of reasons. And again, I don't have time to explain it all. In the States, the ideological, the Judeo-Christian tradition, the strategic alliance and shared values and so on. I keep saying I laugh when they tell me shared values. So shared values, what? Occupation and death and destruction? What? And what is a Judeo-Christian tradition? What is it? I thought that these were mutually exclusive. And at the same time, does that mean you have a club from which the non-Christians and non-Jews are not included? We are the others, so to speak, the Arabs, the Muslims, the Buddhists, or whoever. So these were all sorts of formulae and formulaic approach in order to justify the strategic alliance with the US, for example. That became a real alliance with a very, very strong and active Israel lobby. It's not all Jewish, of course. The Israel lobby, of course, AIPAC is, and it's very, very powerful, and it has been ingrained within the US political system for a long time. And it makes or breaks political careers, particularly in Congress, because they fund congressional campaigns and so on, and they deliver votes and all that. So AIPAC is known, everybody says AIPAC, but there are other organizations that are more powerful. There are organizations like the Council of Presidents of major Jewish organizations, for example, that carry out a Zionist agenda. And it has emerged very clearly that the fundamentalist American evangelicals are the strongest lobby group and allies of Israel. These are really, I mean, they use the Bible as a geopolitical text, as you know, and they mobilize and they support Israel, right or wrong, and they send funds and so on, and they're constantly active. But now many people are challenging the evangelical agenda. It's not the Anglican, it's the evangelical agenda, the born-again people and so on. The Bible Belt, mainly in the south of the US. They're a powerful group. There are others, of course, different groups who make it very difficult for anybody to support Palestine or to criticize Israel in any way, shape, or form, and they've been gaining strength. And this type of pro-Israel lobby was emulated in Europe gradually with Israeli support. They started building support systems, they started building lobby groups, they started funding campaigns and so on. They started interfering in elections, like what happened in England. There was a film, there were two films, one about the Israel lobby in the States and one about the Israel lobby in the UK, where some of the lobby would interfere in politics and would plant, let's say, their own people within the government and so on. Anyway, there are all sorts of devious ways, and there are open ways. The use of the media, the use of power and money and so on. And this became very clear with Germany. There's an added very clear factor. The Germans are very busy blaming themselves forever for the Holocaust. And they unfortunately confuse the Holocaust and support for the victims of the Holocaust with support for a state like Israel, which is really committing atrocities against another people. So they refuse to see the genocide. They refuse to see the occupation. They feel that their guilt is so overwhelming that they can do or say nothing bad about Israel or to Israel. And therefore they see in Israel the heir to the Holocaust, the heir to the victims of the German or West European Holocaust. And that is an added version, that's an added dimension. And they say it all the time. We are the ones who committed the Holocaust, so we cannot in any way criticize Israel. Why? I mean, that's why it's very important that there are many Jewish groups, non-Zionist groups, organizations that stand up and defy this illogical logic, who say, we are the children of the Holocaust, and we don't want you to support Israel as it is carrying out genocide and oppression and slaughter and carnage in Palestine. So the Jewish community is, of course, divided in the same way as the Christian communities are divided, because you have the National Council of Churches that is quite progressive and that supports the Palestinian question. And then you have the evangelical churches that totally support Israel. In the same way, you have Jewish communities that have different points of view. So, and the more power they have, the PACs and the pro-Israel lobbies, the more they engage in interfering, not just in domestic politics, but also in the public discourse. For example, you see now how they have conflated criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. And this is the great sword, let's say, that they have to bash people with, should you criticize Israel? If you do, you're being anti-Semitic. And that's why they are forcing and intimidating people to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which conflates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, which is a totally different thing and is a political thing. But at the same time, once this type of language gains traction, then it intimidates many people. If I want to criticize Israel, I don't want to be accused of being anti-Semitic, which is entirely unrelated. And the Jewish progressive groups are certainly challenging this. There are many, even though in the States and in other places you are having legislature doing that. The same thing with BDS, criminalizing BDS. It's criminal, and this way they will confiscate, governments confiscate their own people's rights to be ethical and responsible consumers or investors by telling them you cannot boycott Israeli products or Israel. You cannot boycott settlement products and so on. And by saying you will be punished if you do. In certain areas, it's illegal to boycott Israel. And if you do, you are punished by being boycotted yourself. So you can be boycotted if you're a firm that boycotts Israel, legally, but it's illegal to boycott Israel. So it's gone so far where some governments are willing to punish their own people and violate their own people's rights in order to protect Israel. So these lobbies have gained sway. They have become very powerful. And of course, they have direct contacts with Israel. They raise enormous funds. They have armies of trolls and bots and so on now with social media. And they want to take over, and they have taken over actually the public domain in terms of the discourse. Yeah. Gradually, the younger generation, the educated younger generation, university students and so on, are beginning to see that this is an overt and unacceptable manipulation of the facts, of realities, and of people's own awareness and perception. And this is very, very important. We don't have the millions and hundreds of millions and so on to spend. We don't have armies of people we can pay and students who, but what we have are people who have bothered to learn the truth, who have accessed the facts, who act on their own conscience, on their own sense of values, and who have challenged the older generation that lived and thrived on the pablum of slogans and cliches, dehumanizing Palestinians, demonizing Palestinians, as you see now, while placing Israel on a pedestal that it can do no wrong. This is changing, and the young generations are not being intimidated. Look at what's happening in the States, as I said. This is incredible. It's really invigorating. And to see, because before, when we used to fight the good fight on mainstream media and the university campuses and so on, we felt alone, we felt isolated, we felt vulnerable. I know what it means to be targeted, to be threatened, to be called names constantly. But now it's really empowering to see that there are hundreds of thousands and millions of people who are standing up, who on their own have taken up the cause and who are saying no more. We will not accept this. We will challenge all these manipulations and oppressive patterns and so on. And having gained access to the truth, whether through social media or other ways, I mean, look, the US wants to close down TikTok, other and there are governments in Europe that try to arrest their own people and to limit their own freedom of speech and political action if they demonstrated or joined in protests against the genocide of Palestine. So the people are way ahead of the government. And the governments certainly are holding on to the same old patterns that are inherited from a colonial past, since Israel was a major investment in the region to carry out functional duties and responsibilities within the Middle East. We can talk about this later. So they want to save Israel from the truth. They want to save Israel from the consequences of its own actions. They even want to whitewash genocide. This is amazing, that they want to give Israel a free pass while it is slaughtering people who are captive, who are helpless. And in the West Bank, don't forget, annexing Jerusalem and transforming the character of Jerusalem, and at the same time in the West Bank, unleashing this horrific force of unaccountable settlers who are fully armed, who are protected by the army, and who are given weapons and funds by the government. And in Israel, you see the emergence of, not emergence, it has emerged, a very clearly fascist, violent, racist system. And this came out in the open, and it triggered responses, because people of conscience everywhere do not want to support a fascist regime. They don't want to support genocide and war crimes and slaughter and crimes against humanity. So that's the transformation now. And that's what gives me hope. I liked your title because you sent me a title saying Horizons of Hope. And I think the horizons of hope are here in terms of the young, the new generation, people of courage, and those who refuse to be put down or intimidated and silenced.
Well, yes. Before I go to the first question, I actually what you said really touched us directly, because like you're saying, our experiences about knowing more, and we see around us how many more people are joining the movement. We see, by the way, even in Berlin, there are people camping in front of the parliament for days now, despite many attempts. And by the way, can I tell you something? One of our like now we're organizing events like movie screenings. Yesterday we had imagine the first time the film Farha was screened in Berlin, was screened because of students. Like students brought it, and the director Darin, she came in person. This was the first time it's being screened in Germany. So yes, so and we have now today a screening also. So, but just to say that there's actually a real interest of people to create a change. And the problem that we have is that there's so many events, sometimes we don't know where to go.
Too much of a good thing, huh?
Yes, it's really, sorry.
No, but you're creating breakthroughs. You are really challenging the constraints and the boundaries of free speech and critical action and so on by saying we will do this. It's okay if you have too many. I mean, you have to be selective where to go, but at the same time, you spread yourself in places so that people can have access to the truth.
Absolutely. Sorry. Yeah. Just to say one last note on this before I do the question, it's that I, for example, was not so courageous because I was new here. But then I saw my colleagues, they still every day, I'm so surprised. People like are being arrested on a daily basis. Jews, Germans, people of all backgrounds, Arab, people of all backgrounds are just not stepping down. Which brings me to
you know, this is the fact. The Palestinian issue has become part of the global conversation on justice and peace and integrity and so on. It is no longer maligned and labeled and so on the way Israel tried to do it. We're not only part of the conversation, we have become really the touchstone, the acid test for the integrity and morality and values that you hold. Where you stand on Palestine is a way in which you can be evaluated in terms of your own values.
That's almost our daily conversation. Adam's first question from Mosaic Center, like from the group in Mosaic Center, is actually kind of related to solidarity. It reads, back in the 70s, you studied in the UVA, where you formed the Friends of Free Palestine. You also formed coalitions with the Black Students Alliance, women's groups, anti-Vietnam War activists, and even Appalachian, I hope I read it, Appalachian mine workers. So the question is, was transnational solidarity easy to build back in the 70s? And what lesson can you impart on our transnational movement today?
Yeah, certainly solidarity has never known a nationality or geographic boundaries and so on. Generally, it's the oppressed who can identify their counterparts, who can identify other people who are oppressed, and who can identify with their language perceptions, not just their suffering, but the nature of their struggles. So at UVA, I was very active, yes. And I was an honorary member of the Black Students Alliance. At that time, they didn't consider us Black. But they said, our Palestinian sister is going to be an honorary member. And I did go and I did join and I participated in the Black movement and in protests against discrimination and racism and so on. It was really fantastic. And I felt I belonged, because I knew what it meant to be excluded and discriminated against. The same thing. And they knew the moment I started talking about the Palestinian experience, it clicked. They knew that we had the same. It's what Angela Davis says. You know, I also sent her support when she was in jail and I was in Virginia. We knew that we had a lot in common and that we stand together, and in solidarity we can achieve a lot. The same thing, the Appalachian mine workers, I used that because I said how they knew much more as workers. I had friends from the New Left, of course, I forgot the name of the organization. And anyway, they were quite active. They had set up communes and so on. And they had friends. They used to be something Workers' Party. Anyway, so they had relations with different workers, different unions, and the Appalachian mine workers invited me to speak. And I went and attended part of the organizational meetings, and I was speaking. And again, we discovered an affinity of some sort, and they knew more about Palestine, I use this, than the teachers who were teaching me in the PhD program at the University of Virginia. Some of the faculty there were so isolated and so ignorant. One, not medievalist, he was a Victorian scholar. When he saw me, he said, I read that you're a Christian. I said, yeah, I was born to. He said, I thought all Arabians were Mohammedans. And this is a professor. So why don't you call us Saracens? Arabians and Saracens and Mohammedans. I said, shows how much you know about Palestine and the Arab world. We have always been a pluralistic society, a diverse society, a society that is tolerant and I said, where did Christianity come from? I mean, Jesus was not blonde and blue-eyed, and Christianity started where I was born. And we represent the oldest Christian tradition in the world. So maybe that should get you to understand who we are. But that's the degree of ignorance and lack of knowledge, because there was so much identification with Israel anyway, and accomplishment and achievement and can do no wrong and so on, that the Palestinians were either pushed aside in total ignorance or were treated with utter prejudice and cruelty. So I said the Appalachian mine workers were much more open and knowledgeable about the Palestinian cause than some of my university professors. Just to give you an example of where real knowledge lies. And this type of networking and knowledge is very, very important. This is where I came across, of course, the modern, let's say, women's movement, because the women's movement and so on is a very old one. In Palestine, it started in the 19th century, for example. But in the States, the women's movement in the 70s was, you know, quite active, and sisterhood and so on. So you end up forming linkages. And many of the people I had known then, I had met then, even though we are older and hopefully wiser and we're getting gray hair and so on, we still immediately sense each other. We still carry with us this experience, this affinity. And this is happening. I see it now with the younger generation. So build up your coalitions, build up your solidarity movements, build up your friendships, build up this common language. When you have been in a struggle with people, you create bonds. The bonds of struggle will stay with you, will strengthen you, and will enable you to take positions that may not be popular or safe, but that in the long run will vindicate you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the answer. Again, it resonates so much with us, and it's so happy that this is not a new phenomenon. It's something that is going to naturally grow, I believe, as you said.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. The second question from Mosaic Center, from our group in Mosaic, they're asking, going back to Madrid and Tunis in the 90s, is there a particular moment when you realized that the peace process had been hijacked? And is there anything you or the delegation could have done differently?
Yeah. as I said, we had a totally different approach from the secret negotiations in Oslo. I was told, Heike, vaguely that there were secret talks and they were succeeding and so on. So I always knew there were back channels and Palestinians and Israelis, because in order to legitimize the PLO, they wanted to have back channels to the Israeli government, so the Israeli government would recognize the PLO and so on. So when I was told there was a back channel, I didn't bother to ask what or why or who, because at one point Abu Ala asked me if, no, Yair Hirschfeld asked me if he could have access to some people in Tunis and so on to talk about the multilateral economic issues. So Abu Ala was in charge of that, and I put him in touch with Abu Ala, and that was it. And then a year or less than a year later, Faisal and I were asked to go to Tunis to meet, to discuss, because we used to consult always. The PLO leadership was in Tunis, and we used to go regularly. And that's where I used to see Nelson Mandela all the time, by the way, although we saw him in the States too. He's one of my idols. It was lovely to see him. So he used to want to ask us about all the negotiations and where we were and how things went. But anyway, so Abu Ammar or Yasser Arafat told us that you need to know that this channel is working. And this was in the summer of 93. And that they have reached an agreement on a document. So I was shocked. I said, there were negotiations. Why didn't you tell the delegation? He said, because you're not politicians. All of you are too honest. If you knew there was a back channel and that there were negotiations behind your back, you wouldn't be able to act, and you wouldn't continue with the negotiations because they were on a different basis. So we wanted you to continue with the Washington talks, but the real talks were taking place in the dark, in Oslo, behind our backs. And I said, that's very insulting to the delegation. And he said, because we knew you were too good to keep up a facade, the delegation. And it's true, because most of them were upset, were angry. Haidar Abdeshafi left and so on. I said, I will stay for the signing. But when I looked at the text of the agreement, I was horrified. I saw it in Abu Mazen's office in Tunis. And I said, this is exactly the opposite approach of what we were doing. And this is such a flawed document that you're putting the PLO under occupation. You are maintaining the occupation and giving them power and so on. You're separating the people from the land. You are entering a phased approach and so on. And the security issue is dominant while the human rights issue is. There were many things wrong with it, and I've written a lot about this. It's not the place to say it now. And I said, can we renegotiate this? Can we at least try to plug some of the holes in there? Can we add a few things? Can we check? As I said, the whole approach was not acceptable, but maybe we can do something about it. He said no, and I looked, and it was initialed already. They had initialed it. So I went, he told me, you can go and negotiate. There was an Israeli in Washington, see if you can change these things. And of course, I tried, and they said, no, this is an agreed document, and it stands as is. But he tried to convince me that the PLO has one common enemy with Israel, which is Hamas. So I said, it shows you how much you know about Palestinian society. Anyway, that's the difference. I mean, as I said, we were adopting the territorial approach, the approach of rights. We asked for the population register and the land register, which till now the government doesn't have. We don't have. Israel still controls the land register and the population register. Till now, Israel acts as a sovereign state over the West Bank and Gaza, and of course it has annexed Jerusalem. they postponed all the major issues to the end without any assurances or guarantees. You postponed Jerusalem, you postponed settlements, you postponed refugees, you postponed boundaries, you postponed water, and you postponed security. And these are all the real issues that we were dealing with, because instead of postponing the core issues, you should solve them, and the functional issues will fall in place. You don't deal with the functional issues at the expense of the core issues and the real issues. And so that's why I said it stood on its head. And I mean, most Palestinians didn't approve of the Oslo Agreement, but we tried very hard. I said, since they committed us to it, let's see what we can do with it, how we can empower ourselves, how we can get the world to support us in our struggle, and so on, how we can maintain the resilience of Palestinians. At that time, you know, the word, and it's still applicable, is sumud, you know, steadfastness. You need sumud, you need to be steadfast, you need national unity. So I hope that explains the difference between what is called the Washington or Madrid process and the Oslo process. And that led to talks for their own sake, a process that went on forever and ever and ever, with no results, with no curbs, with no accountability. And Israel got all the rewards, and we got all the punishments, so to speak.
Again, it's hard to even comment on this, because it's again, it's always the Palestinian being pushed on one direction, which is always to be the barriers of all the troubles, let's say. The next question is a little bit different. As a scholar, it's gonna talk about your literature in relation to your studies. So it says, as a scholar on Palestinian literature, what changes or developments do you foresee in the genre of modern Palestinian literature?
Again, that's a very, very long question. I haven't been following closely developments in Palestinian literature lately, because my work was medieval literature and then comparative literature. So Palestinian literature, in a way, has a life of its own, because the literature of resistance that I wrote about was in the 60s. With Mahmoud Darwish and Samih al-Qasim and Tawfiq Zayyad and all these wonderful writers and poets and critics. Before that, we had the national literary movements in terms of the old established literary figures, Brahim Tuqan and others. Then gradually the poetry and literature of resistance evolved, affected, of course, by international literature, but there is always something in Palestinian literature that has a flavor, a cultural identity flavor. It does not extract itself from its environment, from its struggle. It is a literature of affirmation. Despite all the pain, all the struggles, all the horrors that the Palestinians are going through, and quite often it's perfectly legitimate. You have to describe your pain, you have to express it. But it was used as a way of empowering yourself to be able to overcome it, not to succumb to it. That was the tone and tenor. And it has been affected in many ways, Palestinian literature, especially when I see modern literature, by the modes and genres of contemporary literature globally. Like we have a lot of fantasy literature. I mean, it's not just Isabel Allende or what's his name, who have affected Palestinian literature in terms of fantasy. Marquez, of course, and you have evolved new genres within Palestinian literature. The ongoing narrative, the literature that defies standard structures, the new use of language, and so on. I find it extremely invigorating, even though I haven't followed it closely. But whenever I come across something new and I see new emerging figures who are writing, I feel encouraged that there is the creativity of the spirit, and there is that daring to experiment and to find new ways, even though everybody is diverted and distracted constantly by the challenges of survival, quite often by the challenges of resistance. And to me, the important thing is not to feel you have to be a superhuman. Because to be a Palestinian, it's like a woman. You have to prove yourself that you are up to par, you are better than everybody else in order to gain recognition. And you shouldn't. You should, in a sense, use your humanity to the fullness of what you have, rather than feel constantly on trial, constantly having to prove yourself and be a superwoman syndrome or the superhuman Palestinian and so on. Be yourself. And that Palestinian literature as a genuine, honest utterance and articulation of Palestinian humanity and reality, using the most creative means. I think it has now reached new heights, and I wish I had the time to pursue it even more. But instead of giving daily, webinars and talks, but those of you who have time, you should read some, and know Arabic, should read some contemporary Palestinian literature. It's quite, I did translate quite a few of them, by the way.
Well, I can't believe it, but we're almost getting towards the end of our talk. So we'll take one more question from the audience, and then our wrap up of Horizons of Hope today. So the last question from the audience is, when speaking of German guilt, do you think this guilt, in fact, is a reflex sometimes due to fear of being deemed anti-Semitic, or also a byproduct of the decades of careful programming of the acceptance of the Zionist project as a compensation for Germany's history, instead of actual guilt for the past Nazi atrocities toward the Jews?
Yeah, it's a combination. I mean, you're in a position to know better than I can, but from a distance, I can see that there is a political agenda, and I can see that Israel has used this very, very effectively to constantly provoke this guilt, to bring it out, to constantly use this against, in terms of German policy, to say, who are you? You're the ones who are guilty of the Holocaust. How can you criticize us? Or that you always have to continue with your compensation. Actually, they're paying money to Israel in compensation. You should read Norman Finkelstein's writings about how the money, most of it doesn't go to the descendants of the Holocaust victims, but the Israeli government uses it. Anyway, that's another issue. The demanding for compensation, the demanding of, or constantly demanding the need to atone, that maintains and perpetuates a sense of guilt. So whenever I used to see younger generations and so on, I said, why are you bearing guilt? What have you done? They said, Germany. I said, what's Germany? You're German. Have you been part of the Holocaust? Are you anti-Semitic? Are you oppressing Jews? Do you have crematoria? Are you? And they say, no. Then why should you feel guilty? Okay, Germany as a state did this, and it's one of the horrors of human history. But then you learn from it, and you move ahead, and you make sure it doesn't happen again to anybody. But the thing is, never again seems to apply only to Israel. And this gave Israel not just impunity, but license. License that I'm the victim. I'm the perennial, perpetual victim, and therefore I can do no wrong. And anybody who criticizes me is anti-Semitic and is part of the Holocaust. They even tried to associate us with the Holocaust. Palestinians have never been anti-Semitic, by the way. The Society of Palestine has historically had, Jews, Christians, Muslims, atheists, whatever, living nicely. And when we proposed in 68, 69, the democratic, non-sectarian, one-state solution, this was in order to have everybody living equally in peace and harmony, which of course was turned down because of Jewish supremacy and exclusivity. But to go back, sorry, to Germany, I think it's the German officialdom, official circles, governments, and so on, who are constantly on tiptoe, constantly afraid, instead of articulating anything that is politically responsible when it comes to Israel, they somehow manage to go to the other extreme and end up supporting genocide. Now, this is the guilt part, but this guilt in many ways is not necessarily a spontaneous sense of moral values. It's a sense of fear, it's a sense of expediency, and the Zionist movement has exploited it to the extreme, really. So you have a Zionist ideology on the rise, using these and weaponizing these issues in order to close doors, to prevent any direct interaction with Palestine, with the victims of Israel, and to conflate, as I said, Israeli criticism with anti-Semitism. And you do have rising institutions in Germany and lobby groups and so on that are active. But as I said, I mean, I looked at the protest marches, the demonstrations of the younger generation, and I know that they are liberating themselves, whether from the manipulation of the Zionist movement or whether from the inherited guilt that you cannot be objective and you cannot be critical, you cannot be, but you have to be a person of integrity and courage in order to do justice to the Palestinian people. And you cannot allow Israel to lay claim to the legacy of the Holocaust as being the only people and the unique victims. As I said, there's no monopoly on pain, and there's no one-upmanship on suffering. We don't compare. This was one part of history. You have to liberate yourself from that mentality and from that burden. And you have to emerge into the sunlight, so to speak, where you can take decisions based on their own values.
Well, I'm gonna go on with our
one question, right?
One more question. It's about hope. But I want to kind of mix it up with another question related to something you said, because you mentioned academic and activism go hand in hand, but we find ourselves screaming out loud to say decolonialism is only for your theories in our academic circles, because we feel that it's only being seen as such. So the question is about, and it's for you as someone who's been active for decades, from the university in Beirut to challenging periods in Ramallah for more than 30 years. So what's your advice to young activists who want to keep fighting for the right cause in repressive environment?
Yeah. First, I would start with the advice my father gave me. I mean, my mother was a liberated woman too, so don't be courageous in the pursuit of truth or what is right. You need courage, you need self-confidence, you need linkages, you need to work together. And I keep telling Palestinian women who feel vulnerable and exposed, never work alone. Don't feel that you are not, we are there for you. Work with the movement, work with the feminist movement in Palestine, with the women's movement. Know that we have your back, so to speak, because many people feel that all these constraints and so on can be very costly. Look, when you are engaged in this is a whole other field, we could talk about it again for hours, a decolonization process. The genocide in Palestine has exposed not just the hypocrisy of the West, not just the racism of the West, but the ongoing colonial mentality and white supremacy in a north-south divide and fault line, as well as in an east-west fault line. So the decolonization process now has taken on many different ways and shapes. It's not just against one racial oppressor or an oppressor that wants to civilize you, the white man's burden, and steal your resources and so on. But again, it's become multifaceted, and colonialism has become a mentality of supremacy, of superiority, of exclusion, and so on, and justifying all sorts of injustices. So one has to call things by their name, and one has to identify all, not just the fault lines and rifts, but also the components, the expressions of this new, it's not neo-colonialism, it's, I think, post-neo-colonialism, which is manifesting itself now, using the multilateral system, using, again, selectively international law and humanitarian law and so on, as applying only to some and not to others. And where you see power systems dominating even the judicial systems, the global judicial, like the ICC and ICJ. This is very important to note, that all these systems were created in many ways to help the vulnerable, protect the vulnerable, and to curb the violence and violations of the powerful. They ended up being manipulated by the powerful, and in many ways become non-applicable if the vulnerable is from the south or east or is not white or anyway. So this type of colonialism is quite pervasive, and it has to be addressed very clearly in decolonizing. But it's not enough to decolonize Palestine, because we are facing a settler colonial system which is attempting to erase us entirely. It's not just there to civilize us, or, as they say, to make the desert bloom or whatever. It is there in order to uproot you, to remove you. Look, the genocide in Gaza is the culmination of the Zionist ideology. I can kill as many people, destroy their homes, their infrastructure, their institutions, their colleges, universities, their churches and mosques, everything that means anything to them, and anything, and their hospitals, of course, anything that gives them hope for the future. When you destroy hope, you destroy people's spirit. And what amazes me is the incredible spirit of the people in Gaza. The same thing in the West Bank, when they see the settlers on the rampage, carrying out pogroms, burning cars and destroying homes, and even killing individuals. Not in the same dramatic, all-pervasive way that's happening in Gaza, but in a way that says it's the same mentality of ethnic cleansing and of genocide that's taking place gradually in the West Bank, but very dramatically and obviously and comprehensively in Gaza. So this we have to address. For the younger people, look, there's, as I said when I was in the States, the commonality of oppression is very important. But it's not just the oppressed people who identify each other, as I said, the blacks and the minorities and so on. It's also people of knowledge, people of courage. There is a certain degree of wisdom that comes with knowledge and responsibility. So you don't need to suffer yourself to be able to understand the suffering of others. And you don't need to feel guilty that you don't have the same suffering. As I keep telling, we all have the survivor's guilt, as you know. Every time I wear something warm and the Gaza people are in the cold and so on, every time I look at my house and I say, my God, they don't have all, they're sleeping out in the, they're sleeping in tents, and they just, today they bombed their tents and so on. So every time you eat something, they say they're hungry. Every time you see a doctor, you say they don't have doctors and hospitals. So there is an ongoing sense of guilt. How can I do that? And you mustn't let that overpower you. You must let that be a driving force to make sure you undo this, that you get the people of Palestine the rights that they deserve, that you bring about an immediate ceasefire, that you challenge the government who are maintaining and allowing the carnage and the massacres to continue. that you roll up your sleeves and you do something about it. But if you just wallow in guilt and say, my God, how can I live a normal life when these people are living near death and are starving, then I should do something about it. If I feel that, because if you internalize the guilt only, I'm no psychologist, but very clearly sometimes guilt can lead to paralysis. But if you make it as a triggering point, as a, you know, as a way in which your own energy and resources and so on are used to interfere, to engage, to intervene in this reality and change it, that's where you are doing something meaningful. And you reach out to others. It's very important. I know the individual can make a difference. I've seen it. But there is more power and more effect in collectivity. Ripple effects. Students, young people, older people, people of wisdom, as I said, and courage, people of conscience, they can all make a difference working together. And the more diverse we are, the more this becomes a totally human cause, not just a cause for the young or a cause for people of color or a cause for the oppressor. No, it's for all people who share a vision, who share. These are the real values that we share that can make a difference. And the more organizations, the more networking, the more intrusive actions we have. In the States now, they are carrying out what they call the disruptive movement, where they disrupt talks, where, you know, when they go speak at Congress, they come out with their hands red blood and they say you're engaged in genocide. So they are challenging even directly by disrupting. When they have fundraisers, they challenge. So it's very important, because if you allow the ongoing complacency and sense of power and inertia, that things can continue the way they are and we can get away with it, and with time people will forget. No, this is something that has to be addressed, and we have to be persistent, and we have to use our language, our discourse, our diction, our formulations, not theirs, because we are different.
Yeah. I think this is a very beautiful wrap up to our discussion. And like, we cannot, our group cannot thank you enough for really coming today and talking to us. This is something we really, really appreciate. And
thank you. It's my pleasure. And thank you for inviting me.
It's really our honor. We were like, oh, we can't believe it, it's happening. So we've been very excited to talk to you, and I'm glad we made it happen. And everybody in the comments is also sending lots of thanks and regards.
Thank you for caring enough to make a difference.
Hopefully we never stop.
Good. Hopefully we will solve it in order to be able to stop.
Yes, absolutely.
We will stop them.
Absolutely. I think that should be our target. I agree with you. I thank everybody also who joined us today, and I thank Mosaic for hosting. We could now wish you a great night after.
Thank you.
Seeing you again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Good luck to all of you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.